Hello and good afternoon. It's so good to see so many faces, some that I recognize and some that are new. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our Operations Peer Network learning event. My name is Miriam Dix, and I serve as the facilitator of the Operations Peer Network for Together SC. Now, I do also want to, before we get started, just kind of give you some introductions. Want to first thank our sponsor. I'm not sure that David is on, but David Slade of Marsh McLennan Agency is our sponsor. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Together SC offers a health plan that any of our members are able to join. And David Slade is the broker for our Blue Cross Blue Shield health plan. And if you want more information about that health plan, you can go to the Together SC website and navigate through the services that are offered by Together SC to the members and get more information about the Together SC Association health plan. So we do want to thank David with Marsh McLennan Agency and Blue Cross Blue Shield as our sponsors. Now, I also want to, we have just maybe a couple who are probably joining and will join, but the Operations Peer Network is led by a leadership team of which I am a part of, but we have a chair. Our chair is Stig Rasmussen, and Stig is not with us today. He's out. He had a procedure done, so we wish him well. Hope that he has a speedy recovery. And then we also have our staff, Together SC staff liaison is Ben Bullock, who serves as the COO of Together SC. We also have Spencer Scott, who is our board liaison. He serves on the board for Together SC, and he is the executive director of two different First Steps programs, I believe in Florence County and in Marion. We also have on our team Dawn Dowden, who I do know has joined us this afternoon. I say morning, but it's now afternoon. And she serves as the COO of Homes of Hope. We also have on our leadership team Andrea Tucker. She serves as the CFO of Children's Trust of South Carolina. And then last but not least, we have Jeffrey Fleming, who serves as COO of the Palmetto Project. So those are our leadership team members. Just wanted to give them a shout out because of the work that they do behind the scenes and providing programming that we believe will help you do your work better, to support you in providing resources that are going to help you further your mission. And so having said that, I want to make sure we have enough time to really hear the lesson, the session that has been prepared for us. Our speaker today is Chamlee McGuire. And Chamlee is the owner of Heightened Development. She owns her own consulting agency, and she has over 25 years of experience in the nonprofit sector in various leadership roles, leading organizations through mergers, board restructuring, expansions, and a whole host of opportunities and challenges that she's been able to lead organizations through. And then, of course, after having served in that capacity, she branched out to start her own consulting firm. And so today she's going to lead our session on succession planning. And I am going to, if I haven't left anything out, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chamlee, and then at the very end we will wrap up with about 5 minutes left in our session. So about 12:55 we'll wrap up. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over. Thank you for joining us, and we just hope that you have an amazing time today and that you'll be able to take some things away to help you in your respective roles. All right, Chamlee, thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Hi, everyone. It is my pleasure to be here and see so many great leaders in our state. I'm actually based in Spartanburg, at least that's where I live. And so it's nice to see some new faces that are all throughout the state. I'm really grateful to Together SC and to Miriam and the leadership team for convening this group on a regular basis. It's such an important part of your work, or it's just important to have this kind of support. Having been in the sector for so long, I know firsthand how much networking and support and learning is really important. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. And I do see we've got a lot of different folks here with different roles and titles, and you probably have interest in succession planning for different reasons. And this is just a quick slide on heightened development, but you heard a little bit about me in heightened development already from Miriam. I did want, hopefully you all, as you signed up, saw these objectives. These are the main things that we want to accomplish today, reminding ourselves of what the data is, that, you know, why succession planning is so important and why leadership development is so important. We're going to talk about 5 simple steps to use in succession planning. And this is specifically succession planning with a staff development lens. And then I'm going to share a really simple workbook that you can take back and use as a simple tool to walk you through these steps. Is there anything at all that is missing from these objectives? It's okay to go off mute and share if there's some key takeaway that it looks like we're not going to talk about. I'll try to get it into the hour. No promises, but it's just helpful to know that. No. Okay. All right. I guess we're all in the right place for the right reason. So the data, you all have, if you've been in the sector for a while, have been hearing this for a long time, really as early as around 2008. There's been a lot of data about baby boomers retiring. At that point in time, folks like the Annie E. Casey Foundation came out with some data that predicted that 77% of the sector, particularly among executives, were going to vacate their roles in 5 to 7 years. And we have seen a lot of that since 2008 happen. It happened a bit more staggered than we anticipated, but there has been a lot of turnover and continues to be a lot of turnover. Certainly with the pandemic, we saw some of that turnover speed up. And it's not always just among baby boomers. In fact, we're even seeing folks that are not near retirement age leaving the sector altogether. Another reason this is important, many of you have seen Together SC's commissioned compensation and benefits study that came out toward the end of last year. One of the things we learned from that study is that among those who responded, the largest percentage of people had a tenure, and these were executive leaders, had a tenure of between 2 and 5 years in their roles. And when you're talking about a senior leader role, that is a short period of time. And we also saw that 22.3% of them acknowledged plans to leave within the next 3 years. So we know that the tenure in key positions is not very long. And so succession planning becomes very, very important. We also know that filling positions is much harder across the board now. And that's true not only in the nonprofit sector, but it is true in all sectors right now. It is very difficult to hire. Here is some data from philanthropy.com, which actually is pulling from a report from the National Council of Nonprofits. And you can see the vacancy rates. There are lots of vacancy rates across the board in all roles. Jobs are just very difficult to fill. I imagine we could all of you, if you're in a hiring position, can probably raise your hand and agree that this has been very difficult for you right now. What's really interesting right now as well, Forbes recently came out with a report that says across the board, including in the corporate sector, as the pandemic has waned, suddenly they're seeing a larger exodus of CEOs post-pandemic. And that it's often the high-performing ones that are leaving, perhaps burnout, wanting to stick through it during the pandemic, getting to the other side, and then just being done. And we are seeing that in the sector as well. So it's why succession planning really matters, one of many reasons. So let's get into what to do about it. Some of the key things to think about when we're thinking about succession planning. As a summary, these are the 5 steps that we're going to be talking about today. The first step is identifying the positions that you want to do succession planning for. Often in our sector, when we talk about succession planning, it seems we're only talking about the executive director or CEO role. And certainly that is a very key role that we want to focus on. It's not always the only role that is important in succession planning. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. The second step is identifying core competencies or skills that are specific to the executive director role or whatever role it is that you're doing succession planning around. The third step is then identifying gaps for those that are currently in the role. So you've identified these core competencies. Before you jump to succession planning, taking a minute to just pause and say, okay, here's the person that's in this role right now. How do their competencies line up with what we know to be the core competencies for this role? The fourth step is identifying potential successors for each position based on the core competencies. We're going to talk about all of these steps more in just a moment. And then the fifth one is building a development plan for the successors, and sometimes also for the person that's currently in the role. Sometimes we haven't done a really good job of thinking about the skills and the competencies that are needed. And when we go through a process like this, we realize, wait a minute, we haven't really done a good job of developing some of the folks that are in the positions right now. So the first step, when it comes to identifying key positions, I like to encourage organizations to take a step back. And I do want to say it is okay to start with the executive director. We're going to talk about how to identify other key positions that you might want to do succession planning for. But if you are overwhelmed, like we often are in the nonprofit sector, and you don't even have a succession plan for your senior leader, it's okay to start there. And then after you've got some practice with that role, move out into a couple of other key positions. But I like to encourage organizations to really think about, in your organization, as you look at your org chart, what is there one position, maybe 2 positions, where the breadth of knowledge and the breadth of oversight is so much information, so many processes that they are responsible for, so much institutional knowledge, that it would be really difficult for a person to step in and thrive in that role within a few months. Wherever you can answer yes to that, that is probably a position that you really want to do some intentional succession planning around. Another thing to ask yourself is, what are the positions that require skills or personal attributes that are generally lacking across team members within your organization? Sometimes it has to do with organization culture. It has to do with past leadership. There could be a lot of reasons, but there may be particular soft skills or skill gaps that you find to be lacking really across the organization. And then it's important to take a step back and think about a little bit of succession planning more broadly. How do you train and equip your whole workforce in some of these competency areas? And then finally, is there any one position that, if turnover took place in that one position, there are key processes or services in the organization that would need to temporarily cease and just stop altogether? We always want to avoid that, right? And I heard story after story during the pandemic of places that had to just stop and shut down certain areas, not only because of the health issues and concerns that were brought on by the pandemic, but because people just weren't equipped to be able to pivot. And if someone left, they didn't really have the leadership to be able to keep that going. So I want to stop just a moment before we move on to step 2. I'm just curious from the group, as I share these 3 things to think about, are there any quick ahas like, oh man, I hadn't even thought about this key position, but if we are not intentional in this one area, this could really be detrimental to our organization.
I don't have any key aha moments from this, but I do have lots of questions that I'm thinking about later on, and I'm interested to see if those if we touch on those later. So I thought about some of these issues, right? But when you have a really small organization and you're like, where do I pull from to do the succession planning? That feels like it's one of our biggest obstacles. And are you always going to be looking outside if you don't have some of these key skills or attributes already within your organization? And certainly trying to build up staff members. But when you have a really small group, what if you don't have the people to pull from? What does that look like? But we may touch on that later.
Yeah. And I hope we will have some more time for questions and discussion at the end. And I love an interactive group, so feel free to ask as we go as well. But it's a great point. Tasha, is that how you say your name? It sometimes in an organization, when we think about succession planning, we do also have to think strategically about the hiring process and the type of what really helps about knowing the competencies that we need. And we're about to talk about that in the next step. Is it helps with the hiring and recruitment process as well, right? We make sure then that we start to hire and recruit with some of those competencies in mind, because sometimes we don't quite have the team for them to be they may be potential successors 5 years from now, right, with the right development plan, but they're not the 6-month or 1 year succession plan. And so it's the constant rub in the nonprofit sector, especially in smaller organizations. You kind of have to do both at the same time. So that's a really good point. And so when it does come to step 2, this is where we do start talking about the core competencies. And I encourage you for each role to really just focus on 3 to 5 competencies so that you're very clear and specific, so that it's easy to identify what you need in the position and then who might have it in your organization, where they might be lacking. It's also important to know the difference between skills and competencies. So I want to talk about that a little bit, and this slide kind of breaks it down. We talk in the sector more often about skills, and skills are actually the things that we actually put tangibly into job descriptions most of the time. We aren't always as good about building core competencies into our job descriptions. Skills are learned abilities that are required to perform a task or a job in a specific way. And you can see some examples here. So a skill might be expert use of a donor management system. It might be following best practice steps in engaging a donor. Soft skills might be active listening skills, clear verbal communication. When you talk about competencies, and this is why it's easier to just identify 3 to 5, because competencies are actually a combination of skills, a combination of knowledge, learned abilities, values, behaviors that allow an individual to perform key functions or goals successfully. And competencies are often what set someone apart, set one leader or one manager or one staff member apart from someone else. So an example of a competency might be relationship development. There are lots of skills and behaviors and values that all make up things that make someone really good at relationship development. And so sometimes the easiest way to to identify what the core competency is that you need in a position is to look at who it is that's excelling on your team and determine what it is that his or her, what it is that he or she has that's a little bit different, that gives them that cutting edge. Why is it that they're leading with such success? Another thing that might help is think about if you were in a position where you were hiring for this role and you called someone to check a reference. You got to your final set of candidates, you called and asked for a reference. What is it that the reference might be able to tell you about that person that you would be like, okay, you just sold me. This is who we need for this position. So an example might be Natalia is someone who always wants, is someone you always want on your team because she follows protocols and inspires and motivates others to do so. So they are beginning to describe a core competency. And so what core competency, what description is it that would really resonate for you as the key thing that you need in this role? Sometimes thinking about it that way helps you to really identify what it is that you need. So what are the skills, behaviors, and values that make up the competency? And then finally, those are really the hard part. That's the hard part, because once you've actually identified those, then it's looking around at your team and figuring out who are the people that are currently in the role. Do they have all of these competencies, or are there some areas that they could still develop in order to thrive even more in this position? And that's something that we could easily overlook in succession planning, and that could be really detrimental. What might happen if you forget to first assess the person currently in the role? Y'all are smart people. Can you imagine if you just moved on to finding the successor and creating a development plan for them? Can you see any problems with forgetting to first talk to the person in the role currently?
Yeah, I imagine there might be several problems. There might be things that you didn't realize that person was doing, or challenges that they had, especially if they don't do some sort of exit survey before they leave, and you don't have that knowledge of what they think might be some good attributes to look for in the next person.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully we're doing succession planning long before we know somebody is leaving. And so they may continue to be in that role for a while. So from a staff culture, staff development perspective, we want to make sure that we are really investing in the folks that are there at the moment. And in our sector, we are notorious for example, having someone that's in the program on the ground doing really, really good work, and then we promote them into a management role or a leadership role, which is an entirely different skill set, but we never really equip and train them for that role. Mm-hmm. So it's important to make sure that we are developing the folks that are currently in the role.
Thinking about our strategic plans too, if you have something new or innovative that you're looking to do in the future, and trying to get a particular skill set to move those initiatives along.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, Tasha. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment on the staff development end of things. Sometimes when you look at where the organization is going, the strategy that you are living into, it can create some new opportunities that become stretch roles for people that can really help them to develop. So finally, then, just identifying the potential successors for each role. It's important to make sure that you're doing this based on the core competencies, right? So you've identified these 3 to 5 things, and then you start to look broadly and deeply at the organization to see who has the bulk of these competencies, and where might they be lacking and need more of a development plan. And this is where it's really important for us to talk a bit about or acknowledge bias, racism, sexism that exist. We all have our own personal bias. So when we start to really assess who might make sense to be a successor in a potential role, to really look very specifically at the skills and the competencies, call ourselves on our own bias, and make sure that we are really being fair when we're looking at those skills, and that we're not just naturally thinking about people that we get along with, or who have our same values or way of interacting with others. And then just choosing a person for each position, and it could actually be more than one person, because you could have somebody that is prepared to step into the role really quickly and somebody that needs 3 to 5 years of development. And it's nice to be able to build that bench and really be a part of a part of making your staff feel like you care about their development and that you're going to walk that path with them for the long haul to help them grow. That is key for retention. Make the naming and the development plan conversational. It's super important to make sure that that you're really clear in what it means if you are putting someone into a succession plan. Are they guaranteed that role if someone vacates? Are they not? What will the final selection process look like? What can they expect in terms of support and development? And as you're creating the development plan, making sure that they are really a part of helping to assess their own skills, their strengths and their weaknesses, where they're lacking in some of those different competencies. And I'd love to spend a good bit more time here with step 5, which is building a staff development plan. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Center for Creative Leadership. They have some really great research and data. Their site is a great one to go to sometimes. But they have done a lot of good research around how is it that we learn as professionals? How is it that adults learn? What is the most impactful way for us to help people along their professional journey? And this is what they found. What we often do is send somebody to a class or a training, right? We want you to be the successor to move into this new role. So we're going to send you to a leadership course. And maybe the leadership course has no content that has anything to do with the competencies that you've identified, right? So we want to make sure that the plan is really specific, but even more so, we want to make sure it involves a lot of on-the-job experiences. So you can see here the best cocktail for a staff development plan. Only 10% of it is going to involve coursework. 20% of it might involve mentorship, conversation with other people, someone actually training them on the steps and the processes to something. 70% of it should really be on-the-job experiences and challenges. That's really striking. I almost never see in a staff development plan intentional use of on-the-job experiences and challenges. And this gets back to what Tasha was talking about. What's in your strategic plan? What are the new things that you need and want to do? Sometimes there are some stretch challenges that you can assign to folks that give them that on-the-job experience. The other thing that the Center for Creative Leadership has found is that these organizations that successfully implement these experience-driven things see the most success among their staff. So identifying stretch assignments, like we were just talking about, staffing for development, not just for performance, And this is a really tricky one because if you're in a very small nonprofit organization, leaders get burned out most often when they don't have people that they can delegate to, right? When they feel like they have to do everything. So you do need some people in your organization that are fully equipped and able to thrive, at least in certain segments of their job. But it's also important to be thinking about how you can develop them to the next level, which means giving them those stretch assignments. Creating new experiences, which ideally you would want to match your strategy for the organization. Enhance learning from experience, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. And then promote an experience-driven development culture. So to be just a little more specific about some of those things, how can we facilitate on-the-job experiences and challenges? So making those stretch assignments part of your shared values and culture, it becomes part of your language, right? Everybody starts talking about, oh, I'm on a stretch assignment. This is a stretch goal for me. Taking your core competencies and actually mapping them to these stretch assignments. So it's not just that you've got this strategic goal and you need somebody to help with something. It's, we've got this strategic goal. We need somebody to help with it. And what are the core competencies that could be developed in someone as they do this? And who is it that we really want to be working on this particular core competency? Make sure everyone has a development in place assignment. So again, that becomes part of your language as an organization. These are my goals, but this is my development in place goal. This is the professional goal that I have for this year that I'm working on, that may be a little bit outside of my normal job role, but I am on the program end of things, but I am going to be sitting in all of the interviews that happen in my organization this year because I have an interest in HR and management. So that's my development in place goal for this year. It's just an example. Create new experiences that match the organization's strategy and create growth opportunities. And then finally, and this may be the most important one, develop tools and train managers on coaching principles so that staff team members are given space to reflect on their experiences. There is a big difference in being a manager and being a coach, right? Coaches ask questions. They ask open-ended questions that encourage the people that they're working with to come up with their own solutions, to reflect on their own learning. And as an organization, we really have to train in some of those coaching principles and create some processes, some forms that encourage space for that reflection to happen when individuals are on those stretch assignments. So I would love to really hear a lot from the group at this point on some ways that you have successfully facilitated some of these on-the-job experiences and challenges. I think we learn best sometimes from others' success stories. An example that I have, just to kind of kick it off, and I'm actually going to briefly stop the share so we can see each other's faces a little bit more. If y'all are willing, it looks like we've got a lot of people off camera. If you want to come off camera, that would be wonderful because I love to see everybody's faces. But what I once, when I was in an executive director role, we had someone that was hired as an office manager right out of college. And over time, she developed a lot more skills. And after a few years working with us, she identified that HR was an interest for her. And so over time, she had a mentor relationship with the HR person. She was able to sit in on lots of interviews. She eventually started working on her SHRM certification. And this was all while she continued as an office manager in this workplace. So So she had a really clear development in place goal, and the organization was able to really wrap her with that support. Of course, a few years later, that HR position vacated, and even though it wasn't really written down as a formal succession plan that she move into that role, she was very clearly developed and ready and able to step in. So that's one example that I have, and I'd love to hear from some of you what's worked in your place of work.
Well, I'll start. I'll say that we have had some similar experiences. So with our clinical department, oftentimes we get a lot of interns who come to us for 600 hours for their practicum. We keep them, and the 3 therapists that we currently have as full-time therapists over the course of the years, they started with us as interns, really got to know our program. They had a really solid training under our clinical director. What's challenging in our line of work, since it's very human services focused, and because we're small, particularly with some of the younger folks, when they're looking for new growth opportunities, they might not happen as quickly at our organization. So a lot of people come to us, they get all of the great experience working with clients, and then they go to MUSC or a bigger place where they can really move around a bit more. But using our interns as a study pool where they've had months of experience with us and working with our clients, at least in our clinical department, has been quite successful, with the ultimate goal of when our clinical director moves on, that one of those therapists on staff would be able to move up into her position.
Fabulous. And have you all had some good things in place that help with reflection as they are taking on things that are a stretch for them, that allow them to really reflect on their learning?
Yeah, I would say I think we do a pretty good job around the reflection piece, certainly in case management, when they have the opportunity to really bounce ideas and things off of other staff members from other departments. But also our directors are pretty intentional about asking people, what are your goals in 3 to 5 years? We know that most of our folks aren't going to stay here that long, and we do want them to be successful. So those questions are asked a lot during their 90-day review, their 6-month review, and then their annual review. So anything that we get to in the annual review shouldn't necessarily be a surprise, because we've talked about it and we're trying to build on that skill set throughout the course of the year.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, and just asking the question around career goals, not just with interns, with everybody as they're just getting started, is such an important piece of retention and staff development. Who else? We learn from each other. What has worked well?
I can share really quickly. My story is actually myself. When I came to Children's Trust as the finance manager, well, senior accountant, and our CFO at the time was very intentional about making sure that I was involved in all the experiences and that I was her succession plan, because she knew, you know, who knows what could happen, and she knew there could be other opportunities that would come her way. So from day one, I was always, meeting with the board. I was in all the finance committee meetings. So she even had a couple of occasions where I had to run those meetings where she couldn't be away. So I was able to run those meetings in that finance manager role. So whenever I did take on the CFO role once she left, it was like old hat to me at the time. I'd already, I felt comfortable. I'd been in those places before. Everything that she did, I was kind of her backup, her second set of eyes, so that I'd seen everything before. And so now, every time I hire someone, and now the new senior accountant that I've hired, I try to do the same thing with her, to make sure she's always there, at least in the room. And then we have the conversation afterwards, how did this go for you? Any questions? What do you think about this? So I just kind of learned from what she did for me constantly. Every day I was kind of her shadow with my own work that I still had to do, but I was always her shadow. And kind of knew the job, so I was ready to step into it when the time came.
Great example. And I love those, the personal examples of getting pulled into meetings and the fact that you had no work, you were equipped to step into.
Didn't I swipe my phone to get her door? I don't know if they know that now the lock is on it.
Huh, interesting. Send a message. Yeah, that's weird.
Who else?
This is Doug Taylor at Fact Forward, and I think something that you brought up that we did fairly well was we lost a research and evaluation manager, and we didn't think due to the timing it was going to work to rehire for that position. So there was a staff position under her, and we felt like she had the capacity to grow in the position. So we developed stretch goals and skills and laid that out very clearly and worked with her so that over the next 6 months, if she met those stretch goals, then we would promote her to the next level in her role. And it worked out really well. I mean, she was somebody who needed some confidence, self-confidence, and we had confidence in her. But I don't think she did until she actually was, able to demonstrate her skills and competencies. So, and she's still with us. So that's, I think, worked out really well.
Great, thank you. It's a great way to combat imposter syndrome. If you all have read or know about imposter syndrome, we see it more among women and among people of color, but any of us can have it, but it's just that idea that you feel like you're in a role that you don't belong in, that you don't really have the skills to do this big job. But if you have been in a place where you have been able to practice it before you're actually put in it, and you know that you have been successful in those roles and been given that feedback, oftentimes that imposter feeling goes away. Well, thank you all for sharing so much. I see one familiar face. I see Emily, and Emily, I know you were at the Advocacy Center before moving into the executive director role. Is there anything that was helpful to you that made you really prepared to move into it, or anything that you feel like you didn't quite get that would have been helpful?
Yeah, I have been doing a little reflecting. I think some of this happened, but it wasn't necessarily intentional. It wasn't that I was planning to step into the role, but just the position that I had before did allow me to have some nice kind of co-leadership tag teaming approach with the previous director on various parts of the job. So that allowed me some experience in some components of the role. But I agree. One of the first things I did was go to a course, but definitely the on-the-job experience was the biggest source of learning for sure.
Makes a lot of sense.
Chamlee, I'm going to jump in just a little bit. You have 2 questions in the
Chat.
that may be good to answer at this point.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got one question from Darlene. Who should lead this effort? How does the board fit into the succession planning and keep it on their radar? So great question. Obviously, if we are not talking about the executive director role, the board does not necessarily need to be involved, right? But in the executive director role, we want the board to be very involved because it will be the board that decides who the successor is. So the board actually needs to be involved in creating the plan and signing off on the plan. Essentially, the person leading the effort would be the the person currently in the role and that person's supervisor, right? Because the person in the role with his or her supervisor can best assess those core competencies. What is it that's really needed in the job? And then it's really important for the supervisor to be involved as well, because that will be the person that's helping to find the replacement. You certainly want the executive director, and in the case of the executive director role, the board, to sign off on the plan so that everybody is in agreement. But the staff development piece, the staff development plan is going to be regularly monitored by the supervisor as part of the ongoing support for that person. I do, for those of you that really would find it helpful, have a bare bones template of a written succession plan that could be used for an executive director. And it could be helpful in the sense that there are a lot of communication pieces to think about in succession planning. So it's not only who internally might be the successor, but in the executive director role, if the executive director suddenly leaves, is it planned? Is it sudden? What's the external communication? Who's going to lead the search? Are we going to hire a search firm? Who on the board is responsible for assembling the committee that's going to make that decision? So there's a lot that really needs to be spelled out in succession planning for the executive director. Any other position, you've got hiring systems and processes in place, right? But for the executive director, some of those systems and processes might be a little bit different because they are run by the board. And so you need a really clear written process that the board is aware of, that the board chair has signed off on, and that needs to include internal and external communication, right? You want to be communicating appropriately with the public, but you don't want the public hearing anything or the stakeholders hearing anything before you're communicating that to your staff. And then throughout the whole search process, making sure that there's a key liaison on the board that's really keeping the staff up to speed, because we all know that when your senior leader leaves, it creates a lot of anxiety. Sometimes you have more staff turnover. And so the more that the board is prepared to really communicate regularly and be transparent about the process, the higher the likelihood that a positive culture and less turnover happens as a result. Another question, I really like the idea about training managers to be coaches, not just managers. Do you know of any specific training opportunities out there that are good to send managers to? Great question. I've got just a bulleted handout that talks about the difference, but it's not really a true training on how to coach. And coaching is an art, because if we are not accustomed to asking questions, it's very difficult to move into that role, right? As managers, we want to solve problems and give answers, and that's not the role of a coach. There certainly are coaching certification programs out there, but those are pretty comprehensive for people that are wanting to do it for a living. But there are some good books on coaching. And there are, goodness, I'm trying to think of a couple of coaching books that I've read, and they're not on the tip of my tongue. Is anybody very well versed in coaching? Does anyone know of some trainings that I'm unaware of, or have some books to recommend? I'm happy to share the quick handout.
Are you asking about books specifically for leadership coaching?
Yes.
I can put together a list of things I think might help and send that out to the group. Yes.
Yeah, and I can share with you, Miriam, there's, I do have a list of good coaching questions to ask for different scenarios. And sometimes that handout can just be helpful. If you are, as the manager, know you're going to put your coaching hat on, to have that in front of you. Sometimes you've got the questions in front of you, and it makes it a little bit easier, because it's really about asking the right question at the right time and having enough self-determination, restraint, I guess, to not try to jump in and solve the problem.
Mhm. Yeah. Coaching really lends itself to, so we talk about coaching versus consulting, right? Because as a consultant, we come in, we identify a strategy, we put together a plan, and then we can help you implement that plan. But if we're going to coach, then we're really trying to understand where it is that you want to go, right? So you're here today, where do you see yourself in the future? And then helping you work through the idea and the ideas that you need to work through as far as how you get there, and then coming up with a plan for how you get there. So the coaching piece is really giving someone else homework, not doing the task yourself, right? And so we do have some leadership coaching available here at 180 Management Group, which I did not say. That's the company that I own and that we consult for organizations. But I will give some resources for leadership coaching and put that into our Operations Peer Network Slack channel. So that's a good segue to that Slack channel. And we'll talk about that when we wrap up. So Chamlee, I'm giving back to you.
Thank you, Miriam. That's fabulous. I love that you'll have a Slack channel. And the beauty of doing some coaching with your staff is that if you do it right over time, you will less often be the only term I can think of is battered, be constantly having folks come to you with every little problem and asking what to do and how to solve it. Because if you reframe it and ask the question of, what have you thought about? What do you think the best decision is? What are the pros of that decision? So if you go through a series of questions to where they realize that they have the answer themselves, over time, they begin to solve all those problems instead of just coming straight to you. I am, as Miriam talks in just a minute, going to put this Google Drive link in the chat box. This is just a quick worksheet that helps to walk through the 5 steps of succession planning that we just talked about. So you all can use that as a resource. And then I just wanted to end with this quick framework. I think we all know why staff development, leadership, succession planning matters, but everything is about leadership. And so this is something that I talk about a lot within Heightened Development. When I do a leadership series with executive directors, we talk about this some. Ultimately, to be able to take action on our mission and meet the objectives of our strategic plan, all of these other things have to take place first. So it is values that drive leadership, and then leadership drives your culture, and your culture drives your strategy. So Peter Drucker says culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that is true, but it is actually values and leadership that dictate your culture. So it's important to really know your core competencies, your values that matter across the organization, and to have the right leadership if you're going to be able to get to your strategy. So I think we're almost out of time. And so I am going to turn it back over to Miriam, and I'll put that link in the chat box.
Thank you so much, Chamlee. We definitely appreciate all that you have given to us today. There were several resources that I picked up on. One was the Center for Creative Leadership. So Chamlee did mention that particular resource that we could go and look up, information about, leadership development, a whole lot of things. So I wrote that resource down. And then, of course, she's leaving us with a tool, the 5 steps of succession planning. And so thank you again for that tool. I just want to say that the Operations Peer Network does have a Slack channel. So in that Slack channel, we haven't been as busy, mostly because we're not getting a lot of engagement. So if you're looking for information and resources, please ask your question in the Slack channel. We can also put the resources from our sessions in the Slack channel. We'd love to answer your questions. Chamlee, you're welcome to join our Operations Peer Network and join the Slack channel. You may have some resources that you'd like to provide as questions come up in our Slack channel. And so we really want it to be a community effort where all of us who are working in the sphere of operations can lean on each other when we need information and then when we have wins, because we all know that working in operations is sometimes a very thankless job, right? And you could be sort of the only one of your kind in your organization who's thinking very operationally minded. And we want to be able to celebrate you when you have a win, because we get it. We absolutely get it. So please join our Slack channel. You can do that just by going to Together SC. And actually, Ben may have put a link up there. I don't know if Ben put a link in the chat or not to the Slack channel. But
I can do that.
thank you so much, Ben. And you'll have the link right here, right now. But if you need to come back to it, of course, it's still on the Together SC website under Operations Peer Network, and you can join our Slack channel from that page. Okay. So with that being said, if there are any other questions for us, either Chamlee or for us as peer network leaders, we have Ben Bullock on the session today. We have Dawn Dowden on the session today. You've heard from Andrea Tucker today. And so we're all here to answer any questions you might have. I will say that if you have not already signed up to be a part of the summit, I'm not sure if there are any spaces left, but the Operations Peer Network will be presenting at the summit coming up on March 7th. For Together SC. And we would love to have you as part of our sessions. And we'll also be working in a sort of a group roundtable discussion where we're going to work on, understanding more of the needs of our peer network members so that we can serve you better. So definitely plug in if you have not already. So I think that's my spiel. Anyone have anything else? For the good of the cause? No? All right, we will have some events coming up. Please, continue to look in the For Good Connections newsletter that's sent out by Together SC for any events that we will have upcoming in the future. All right, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
There's the link in the chat box. Sorry, it took me a minute to get it. Everybody's going.